Mm. Well, kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Rachel Froggett and I'm Secretary General of the International Working Group on Women in Sport. And for those fellow Kiwis in today's call, I'm also Chief Exec of Women in Sport Aotearoa. So cannot believe that we're already at week 7 of our Leadership from Lockdown series, which began as a tiny idea and has exploded into a really interesting series of leadership interviews with people not only in New Zealand but all around the world, and not to mention today's guest, who is dialing in, of course, from our cousins across the ditch in Australia. I actually met this person for the first time in early March, although of course knew of her by her significant reputation before that. And I'm really pleased and privileged that we've been able to bring her to you today, because I think after several weeks of living through lockdown and emerging from our COVID-19 crisis here, we're now beginning to have the kinds of discussions about what we want our sports sector to look like going forward. And obviously last Sunday, our Sports Minister, Grant Robertson, made a very significant announcement that $265 million will be reinvested back into sport over the next 4 years to support not only rebuilding and recovery, but also creating a brand new system that is far more inclusive of women and girls, of people with disabilities, and of people with lower socioeconomic circumstances. So an incredibly exciting part of the world to be living in right now in terms of the next steps from here. The other really exciting thing is this week, for those regulars, we have a brand new moderator with us, which we're actually really excited about. So a very good friend of ours and good friend to women in sport across New Zealand, the wonderful Zoe George, who many of you will recognise from Radio New Zealand back in the day, and obviously most recently writing for stuff.co.nz. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Zoe for her debut. Zoe.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for that, Rachel, and it's so great to have you all here with us today. We are jumping across the ditch to joined by Dr. Bridie O'Donnell. Now, she was a surgeon turned pro athlete turned sports administrator. In her 30s, she stepped away from medicine and decided to be a pro athlete. Now she is leading the peloton. Sorry, Bridie, couldn't help myself. As she's the first ever director of the Office for Women in Sport and Recreation for the Victorian Government. Fun fact about Bridie, she was a math Olympian. She joins us from her kitchen in Melbourne. Kia ora.
Kia ora, woman speaker. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm appropriately dressed. I'm wearing my as one scarf because, of course, we find out in just over a month whether or not Australia and New Zealand will be successful, being the first ever dual confederation bid to host a Women's World Cup in 2023. So everything's crossed that we get that one across the line. I'd be really super excited to see your team and my team play the rest of the other teams in the world.
Yeah, it will be a fantastic tournament if we can get that. Now, things are changing rapidly at the moment. New Zealand's just moved into level 2. But what's it been like over in Australia? I know that the restrictions have varied across states. So what's it like being for you in lockdown?
So I'm in Melbourne, and Victoria's, look, we've been very, very fortunate broadly in Australia. We've had 100 people die of coronavirus. It's just really tragic. But you also look at the numbers that we're seeing internationally, and so there's no comparison. We're very fortunate, I believe, this is just my personal opinion, but we've got a really terrific Chief Health Officer who's been probably early on in our process more conservative than others might have been, more cautious perhaps. But what we've seen is the consequences of that have been that it's actually protected people in Victoria really well. I think general citizens have generally been really good at observing social and physical distancing, and now things are starting to open up. We've got some exemptions for professional sport, community sport, people and recreation is allowed to happen, but in groups, small groups of 10. No community sport competition as yet, but that's certainly something we're hoping to see change in the coming weeks to months. But I mean, personally, I live alone, and I've been living in my house for 9 weeks, working from home at my kitchen table. So I'm experiencing my own, what that's like to be in isolation. I don't think it's any easier or harder to be on your own, or to have kids, or to have a partner. And, you know, everyone's got their own challenges. I'm just really fortunate that I'm employed, I'm healthy, I'm safe, my family are healthy, so I'm very lucky.
Yeah, sport, we talked about just then, is also in lockdown. What's that looking like? And in practical terms, what has that meant for sport from elite to those grassroots levels?
It certainly shows people how much they miss it. You know, it has to be cancelled or shut down completely, and everyone thinks, oh my goodness, you know, this is what we used to do on our weekends, or it's what we used to watch on our TVs or our screens. It's what we feel passionate about or invested in. It's what we care about or love. And I think as individuals and as an active person, it's also about reminding ourselves how much we like to be active, move our body, test our body. And for some people, engage with others when they do that, if it's a team sport, or even going to a gym or a yoga class. So everyone's missing it a lot. We're also really mindful that while we can control some elements of how professional sport might return to play, because there's greater support staff or a greater financial support to ensure those teams and clubs observe rules, it's a lot harder to control groups of under 11 soccer players or a swimming squad or whatever. So it's totally understandable. And as a doctor, I know this. You can't just turn on a switch and open things up again. It's really going to have to be phased, and people are frustrated, which is absolutely understandable. But I feel like everyone's actually doing their utmost. And my colleagues, I'm completely biased, but my colleagues who work in the department are absolutely working their tails off to try and do this the best way and communicate as frequently as they can. So it's tough for everyone, but we all want to get to the end of the year with healthy, safe environments, and there's and no re-spike, no reinfection rates.
Well, we're seeing a move back to professional sport here in New Zealand. We know that the NRL is just about to start next week in Australia. We've got the ANZ Premiership Netball starting and the Super Rugby. And there's been kind of talks around whether community sport will start up again, possibly within the next month to 6 weeks. Is that looking like a possibility for you over there too?
We're trying to compile a lot of information and do that safely. We also are seeing the challenges that are occurring within community sport that mean that some sports are different from others. You know, contact sport's really different from tennis. So tennis are pushing hard and saying we're already physically distanced to have games of singles or doubles. And that's totally understandable from their perspective. They think, come on, give us a head start. And we're already seeing, of course, people running, riding, now surfing, sailing, yes, and fishing and golf have returned. So it's happening in a phased way. But we also know that, you know, it's a political environment. We're seeing this in Australia. There's frequently a bit of division between states, or people, opposition members of different parliaments will use anything they can as a hook to kind of attack that whatever government is in whatever state. And obviously we have states and jurisdictions, so we have those 3 levels of government. Lucky you, cross the ditch with your smart Prime Minister and your terrific 2 levels. But you know, every situation has been different. So we hope and anticipate that there'll be some more flexibility around gathering sizes and around groups of people in the indoor areas. That's been a really interesting one to navigate. And hopefully in those coming weeks, all things going well from a health perspective, we should see some changes in community sport.
Let's talk about the role that you do. You're the Director of the Victorian Government Office for Women in Sport and Rec, and you started that in 2017. Why was that office established, and what were some of the objectives of that office?
2 years earlier, in 2015, the government decided to have an inquiry into women and girls in sport and active recreation. It was a panel of people were assembled to review data, to look at evidence, to interview people and do sort of an assessment of how we were going around gender equality in sport and active recreation. And Peggy O'Neill, the first and only female president of an AFL club, who's won a premiership twice, she chaired that inquiry. And the following year, there was a sort of launch of a campaign, but there weren't a lot of legs to that at the stage. And then finally, they determined they should create an office for women in sport and recreation and actually dedicate some budget, but also some people and policy resources to addressing the report that came out of the inquiry. The report had 9 recommendations, and they were actually all, you could argue they were slightly esoteric motherhood statements. You know, let's get more women in sports media, let's get more women onto committees and boards. There was one KPI around board quotas, but the remainder of them were all very important, but not necessarily targets that we could hit. I started in November 2017. I got some staff by March 2018. And for the last 2 and a bit years, we've been focused on creating a strategy, looking at policies that could be supported by other parts of sport and rec investment, and then creating grant programs that aligned with other styles of grant programs, but that specifically targeted women and girls who were working or volunteering or seeking leadership positions in sport and active recreation. And for this conversation, and broadly for any time that I'm speaking, the word participation from my perspective doesn't just mean the person who's being active on the field or the pitch or in the pool. Participation in sport means maybe I'm a referee or an umpire, or I want to be a club president. And what we saw was women and girls, and if we speak about women as adults, perhaps as a more generic and easily generalised about group, they're active, mostly at the same rates as men. There are definite drop-off points in which their activity changes, you know, adolescence, university time, pregnancy, perimenopause, and elderly women there's all dropout rates at those points. But they're absolutely underrepresented in leadership roles and decision making. And that for me is a huge gap and a massive opportunity that policy can serve to change. So when I say leadership or decision making, I mean, is there a woman on the court directing the athletes? Are there women referees? Is there a woman in the room when they make a decision about broadcast rights? Is there a woman president? Are there 40% women on your board? Because that's where the power is. It's where influence is. It's where people can put up a hand, and this is just a really basic example of a community sport problem. You know, if you think about a footy club deciding to have an end-of-year party where they have a stripper come to the footy club and entertain some 18 to 25-year-old men, you have to ask yourself, if there'd been women on that club committee who'd signed off on that, would they have signed off on that? Would they have said, great idea, let's use our footy club environment to have a stripper come and get naked in front of men? Now, there's nothing wrong with strippers, but why can't that club go to a strip joint? Why would they need to make a sporting environment that we want to be family friendly be about the objectification and sexualisation of women? And so we want to see women presented in all roles in sport, not just cutting sandwiches in a canteen or washing uniforms. We want them to have decision making. And so from my office's perspective, that's a huge priority.
Yeah, one of your objectives was having that 40% quota on boards, and I understand that it was meant to be hit by July 2019. How did you go with that? Because right now New Zealand has the same quota in place. All major sports bodies are expected to hit it by the end of 2021, and we're sitting at about 50% of those boards reaching that target at the moment. And actually, in fact, one of the it was Badminton New Zealand, they were able to reach the quota while we were in lockdown, so that was brilliant. But
that's awesome.
How did it go for you, and what were the challenges that were around that?
I would say it was a big success. We got to the deadline of 1 July. We had 93% of our funded organisations, of 112 funded organisations, had achieved the quota. And of the 7% who didn't, they'd all met with us and we'd started a plan on how that was going to happen. I'd say there were probably 2 phases to the whole process. The first phase was the fact that when I started, sports had already known about this for over a year. Probably we're at the halfway mark. They were at the 18 months in, and most of them had done nothing. Now that's totally understandable. It was a thing that got released in the paper and maybe someone sent them a letter and it probably got filed away somewhere. So then in 2018, when I started in proper, we decided to communicate with them regularly. there is a deadline. This is what it means. I want to understand how you're going. Tell us your numbers now. What can we do? And there was some engagement, but there was also just complete obliviousness or denial or absolute other priorities that people felt were more important to them, or were financial related or whatever. So we needed to make sure that our communication with them was, this is really serious, this is why, let's help you understand why it's important. But actually, more importantly, the second phase of it, which was about the 9 months to go, me really intensively supporting organisations who were resistant to the idea of gender equality. And that was a huge learning for me as well. I think it might be fair to say that people in on this call today, or people in the audience, have an understanding about women in sport and where there might be gaps and why we need to do more. And you can, when you work in any sector, feel you can be in a bit of a bubble and you think, sure, everyone cares about this. We all want to see more women's sport. Then you realise there's a whole universe out there that don't. They don't think about it, or they don't want it, or, and this is something I've learned in the job, they're actually really concerned and anxious about what this means for them personally or for their organisation. They think, are you saying that I'm no good on this board, that my value isn't there anymore, and you want to swap me out for some woman who doesn't know anything? You know, so actually a lot of people in positions of leadership are deeply anxious about what it means for them. What are they going to lose about bringing women onto a board? Instead of thinking, what might we gain? How might our club or our organisation actually function better, make more money, bring in more membership? So that for me was me understanding, meeting with all of these men who were CEOs and presidents to say, tell me about trap shooting. Tell me about motorsport. What are your issues? And guess what? Every single one of these organisations that was resistant have majority male membership. They feel like their board should reflect their membership. They acknowledge they want more women members. They don't know why they don't have them. They say they frequently had an anecdote, which was, we asked a woman to be on a board once. She said no. Or women don't want to be on boards. And so we gave some really practical and specific advice and said, you need to explain to people why you want them. Tell them that this is about honouring a quota, but you also have a skills gap. You know, so it actually helped organisations do skill matrices and say, we don't have a lawyer on our board, or we don't have a governance person. We don't even have anyone who's ever done an AICD course, a board training course, or we don't have someone who could drive membership. So then they specifically went out and tapped people on the shoulder and said, we need you, Jenny, because you know about membership and you've driven that before in your organisation. You're terrific. Will you be on our board? Also telling them, hey, maybe you don't have a 7-hour board meeting that goes all day at a pub. Maybe you could respect people's time more and realise that not everyone who's on a committee, a voluntary board, has all day to talk about it. And we know if we're going to generalise about a 30 to 50-year-old woman, she probably has a job and she probably has children. So she doesn't have all day to talk about motor racing, but she does have 2 hours, 6 times a year to talk about the governance of that sport.
What are the biggest concerns at the moment in regards to the impact of COVID-19, particularly on women's sport?
Many of us might have read about the broader gendered impacts of a pandemic. So the impacts it's having on women's health, their safety. You know, violence against women is a huge concern in Australia pre-COVID. It's becoming more concerning with people in lockdown. Access to education is a huge one in other countries. I would say specifically a focus, as you asked about sport, has this idea about bounce back. And I was fortunate enough to be on the ABC TV program Offsiders, where we looked at community sport and what we wanted to see post-COVID. And I said, I'd like us to not use that word bounce back. I want to bounce forward. I want to help community sport understand where they can get some quick wins by doing stuff that is more inclusive than ever before. And it may not cost them more money. It may not take up more space on a pitch or use more equipment. It might just require some time and energy of reaching out to different people. So vulnerable communities and re-engaging them, or engaging them for the first time post-COVID, that's a big priority, not just for me in the Office for Women in Sport, but for sport and rec broadly. How can we make sure Aboriginal Victorians, people with a disability, new arrivals, called community, and the LGBTQI community broadly, women and girls, cannot be left out in this conversation when we restart sport? Because you can see for many sporting clubs, and if I was to choose a few high participation sports, Aussie rules, basketball, football, soccer. It'd be just easy to get your senior men's team back on the pitch, and then you can go to your community sponsors and say, hey, you're still going to kick in 10K to sponsor the senior men's team on the jersey. All that stuff starts to get rolling, and then you think, oh, wow, hang on, what about that wheelchair basketball team we had? It's too hard, or, you know, we're talking about this daily with everyone about the importance of ensuring that sport and recreation is broadly for everyone. And Victoria, I feel very proud that we have generally good inclusion, but there are still so many kids and adults that probably don't feel connected to sport and recreation. They feel like, oh no, that's for straight people, or that's for white people, for people who are able-bodied and I'm not. And I think this is another huge issue, and I'm sure you're feeling this in New Zealand and elsewhere, is the financial barriers to returning to sport. You might have paid a club membership or a registration, and you're not getting that at the moment. And how do you afford it in another 6 or 12 months? And what are the offerings? And have you lost your mojo? Have you lost your fitness? Have you lost your confidence? So these are the issues we care about. I also think, from my perspective, there's been a concern around professional sports, the impact on their bottom line, and they've let staff go or they've stood them down. We want to make sure that not just the women working in professional sport get their jobs back, but that AFLW, WNBL, W League, all the W's, I wish we didn't have to have the W's, but that's a whole other essay, that we want those to return in the same way, with the same content and the same broadcast opportunities. So yeah, there's a lot to do, but we're trying to do it as best we can.
Well, we've got plenty of questions, and do send in some if you would like to put one in. There is a question here. Are there statistics available, projects tailored towards getting more Indigenous Pacific Māori girls and women participating in active recreation and sports leadership roles in Victoria?
So yes, in answer to your question, there's a couple of things that we're doing. We held forums last year that looked at 5 vulnerable cohorts of groups of people that we know are underrepresented in sport and recreation, whether it's participating actively or being in leadership positions. Acknowledging, of course, intersectionality is a huge and important component of this discussion. You're not just Aboriginal or Māori, you're not just a woman with a disability, you are many things. But in particular, looking at Indigenous communities, what we know in Australia and Victoria specifically is programs and projects and sports run by and led by Indigenous people work better for Indigenous kids and community, obviously. Ensuring that expectations are really clearly communicated. Like, why are we running this program? We just want to see more girls being active, playing rugby league or rugby union or netball. Great. Or if you want to put a team in a league, if that's your objective, that needs to be really clear. I think also we've got an Aboriginal sport and rec team who work in Sport and Rec Victoria, and a big part of their work is actually around reconciliation action plans to support broader sport inclusion. So if you're Basketball Victoria, we want to know that if you're a family that rocks up to a club somewhere and says, oh, hi, we'd like to play, and this is my kid and she's 12, that if that kid's Aboriginal, and is absolutely, in terms of outward appearance of someone who could be a victim of racism or a victim of being excluded, that club knows the best way to communicate with those kids, with that family. And the idea around management of issues, you know, if you've never had a complaint in your club about racism or sexism or homophobia, doesn't mean it's not there. Probably means people don't feel safe enough to bring it to the president or to bring it to the organisation. So we're never afraid of hearing from a sport that they've had a concern, because that means that someone there felt safe enough to raise it, to complain, and then we support them in managing those issues. If I think about Pacifica, Māori and Aboriginal communities in Victoria, a lot of them do gravitate towards particular sports and codes, and Rugby Victoria obviously has a huge Pacifica community of participation in their Super Rugby teams, women's and men's, but also at a club level. And I think 70% of participants of rugby in Victoria are from a Pacifica community. Yet one of the really interesting things is, not interesting, is that there are no coaches who are Māori or Pacifica. They're all white guys. So Rugby Victoria acknowledged this. This is a challenge for them. They want to see more people in positions of leadership that look like, sound like, play like the players. You know, that whole I want to see a pathway from how I could go from playing to coaching or from being grassroots to elite. So I think we're doing okay in some areas, in some sports. Aussie Rules is another one where we've had exceptional players on a national scale, but we still see pockets of inclusion that go well and others not so well.
Yeah, all right. We've got some more questions here. Joanna Wood says, where have you seen the biggest gain with women in leadership roles? Are there any codes which are more successful than others?
In Victoria, as a state, where I can say this because I'm originally from Queensland, but they're deeply Aussie rules focused. You know, that's what gets most of the back pages of the sports paper. It's most of the talk back on sports radio is about contracts and players and performances, etc. Other high-profile sports, racing, horse racing, motor racing, and then finally we get to sort of January, and tennis means that there is equal representation of women and men, both in players and commentators, which is awesome. So why I'm bringing that up is because what I've seen is actually really good work by some of the minnows in a state. And so what we see is it's probably easier to be a good citizen when you're a very small organisation, and to target gender equality as a part of your business as usual. But what I'd like to call out are some of the really fantastic behaviours by Olympic sports. So if you think about a sport like hockey, and I know you guys performed incredibly well. I keep imagining you're all New Zealanders, but I know you're not. Apologies. Hockey's a great sport for all those Americans watching. But, you know, Australia's performed really well in hockey in Olympics for men and women, and as of New Zealand, and in India, it's the #1 sport in India, more than cricket. Mm. And hockey has historically been a really gender equal sport. They've had similar investment into men and women. They've alternated the showcase games on a fixturing so that men play one week at the final game and women play the next week. Hockeyroos have won medals at Olympics. Kookaburras have won medals at Olympics. So that's a sport that does a really good job. They've got a gender equality action plan that we supported them in through our Change Our Game Champions program. They've got great women executives, and they're very mindful of the need to support women in sport. That said, hockey's a pretty hard sport. You don't play it for fun. You play it when you're good at it. It's expensive. You play it at winter. So it's not actually, we're not seeing the same participation numbers as we see in Aussie rules or basketball or soccer or football. So there's trade-offs everywhere, isn't there? Swimming's another good one that you could argue from a participation perspective, we do great and the women win a lot of medals. But swimming, Australia and Victoria, similarly with tennis, Australia and Victoria have pointed out to me, and they talk about this publicly, they do great when it comes to athletes, but they're really not great when it comes to coaches. You know, there are hundreds and hundreds of tennis clubs in Victoria, and only 6 of them have a woman who's the tennis pro who coaches, and the other hundreds don't. So where we're seeing it is the smaller niche sports. Fencing is an amazing sport in terms of representation of women as the president, as board members, as key officials. That's another one. I'm really keen to see how many women can get accreditation to be internationally recognised officials, and cycling is lacking in that as well. So I don't know if I can point out a winner that's doing well unless it's a sport that's already been dominated by women, which of course is a sport very familiar to all of us, and that's netball. Netball does an amazing job of supporting women as players, coaches, officials, and administrators. And that, I think, and without any criticism to the sport of netball, because it's brilliant, has also been a much more around a history. It's a legacy of being that sport that only women were able to play up until maybe 30 years ago. So it's cultivated a lot of really wonderful people to contribute, who the majority of whom have been women. But that's not because it's been a concerted effort. It's because it's been a sport that a lot of women are passionate about. They play it, their daughters play it, now their granddaughters are playing it.
Yeah, we've got another one here. What regional differences do you see in Australia in promoting more female participation in recreation, and also compared to New Zealand?
So Victoria, in terms of size, obviously is not one of the biggest states. Queensland and WA is obviously a huge state, but a much smaller population. So if you're from regional or rural Victoria, you're a fair way away from a major centre, but it's not epic distances. But if I think about, we've held a lot of regional forums, and the feedback that we get is there are frequently absolute champions who advocate for gender equality in their particular sport, or maybe in their council, or they're the mayor or the CEO of that council, or maybe they're driving a really great program around netball or football or something like that. But if there isn't a champion, if there isn't a woman who's working in a regional sport assembly or an academy of sport or a local council, then sometimes those things just become too hard. And the traditional delivery models of the traditional sports are just the ones that are offered. So if you're a girl who wants to play netball or footy, or you're a boy who wants to play footy, then if you live in the country, you're probably okay. But if you're not, or if you're gay, or if you're Aboriginal, or if you've got a disability, or you're a Sudanese and you've only been in the country 6 months, the offerings are reduced. And we know then that what we've seen, and if I list some of what the regional and rural parts of Victoria would say are deficits, it's around availability of fields. You know, there's one field for every game of every code, or a lack of water has been a huge issue. I mean, we had drought in the lead up to our major bushfires. Then we had the most devastating bushfires across this state that we've ever seen, with loss of life, loss of property, and a huge impact on community sport and amenities and actual facilities. And now we're all in lockdown. So Victoria has really been hit hard, and I think what we're going to see is actually regional and rural parts of the state are going to be forced to be more innovative around the way they deliver things, or even just make change. I mean, here we are, we're having an online leadership forum. I think what we're even seeing, one of the great participants in these conversations we have with our state is someone who runs GIP Sport. So this is the eastern part of the state, right on that pointy bit. He's a great CEO of Regional Sport Victoria, and is always thinking about, what are some of the ways we could be more innovative in engaging ideas, sharing information, partnering with professional teams to bring their team down and have some showcase games. So the Latrobe Valley Authority was set up to sort of support that area. And then they delivered some Collingwood netball games and some Western Bulldogs footy games, so that then the community could connect with them. So it does sometimes rely on a champion or a person who's highly motivated, and there's always the fear, and I'm sure you might experience this in your countries, that what if those people leave and they go to the city? Do we lose them? Or a brain drain? You know, we've seen that in rural, where I grew up in Queensland. You know, you didn't see always the greatest minds and most motivated people staying in tiny towns. They would want to go to the capital city and get a bigger job maybe, or something with more opportunity. So we can't blame them. That's not their job to save a town. But we also need to ensure that regional and rural parts of the country are selling themselves as we need you to do this and we want you to deliver. So it's an ongoing challenge.
Greg has given us a fantastic question. He says, you touched on professional sport and their bottom line post-COVID. Is women's sport in real danger of losing all the small gains at that level that women have made over the last few years? For example, Rugby Australia reviewing women's high performance programs. New Zealand Rugby is still not able to give us answers on the women's provincial competition over here.
It's certainly been a worry. I mean, look at social media and people who are asking these questions. And if I use the AFLW and the AFLM as an example, the AFLW got stopped 6 games into their 8-round home and away season. So we're in season 4. The league had expanded, and then we all went into lockdown. They went, right, that's it, no more AFLW games. They didn't appoint, they didn't say, here's Freo, they've won every game. They're kind of the minor premiers, well done you. There was no thought of that. And then in the sort of 4 weeks, all the conversation was, oh goodness, when will AFLM start? I put the M on the end for obvious reasons. You know, when will it start, and who will play and who will get paid, and the players are getting paid less. And everyone was sort of saying, excuse me, don't forget women play footy too. Let alone, and this is a real passion for me, I'm no expert, but basketball is, you know, the WNBL is the oldest professional league in this country for women. We've had more than 40 years of professional basketball, and it's a travesty that it's still not got a really good broadcast deal. We keep medaling at every Olympics, and our opals are sensational, and some of our players have been the best in the world. But sometimes the focus can be on, geez, when are we going to get the NBL up and running? And you think, what about the WNBL? I mean, women come from America and Europe and the the West Indies to play basketball in this country. We've got a strong league. And so I think that it's about reminding as broad commentators as we can all be, but from my perspective, in a really privileged position to be sometimes in those conversations, I'll say, and what about the women's team? And what are we doing there? And when we were talking with our tourism conversations around projections over the next few months, and we're thinking, gee, what could we do differently? I kept saying, and have you spoken to the women's teams? And they'll say, oh, no, but I will. Now,
it's almost like an afterthought, isn't it? Sometimes, oh yeah, forgot that they're there.
Yeah. So in answer to your question, Greg, I think it's a bit about persistence. And this is perhaps slightly deviating to some theory around leadership, but I think, and this is not, sorry, it's not my idea, it's a theory, something that's been discussed for many years, but girls are socialized to be liked and to be likable. That's a really powerful context in which to grow up, trust me. And then if you're like me and you're an athlete and a med student and a doctor, that you don't just want to be liked and likable, you want to get it right. You want to be good. You're in a ward round and you're being presented to a patient and there's a senior doctor asking you questions. You want to be tested and then you want to show that you know things. So I know there are disruptors everywhere and that the world needs them, but I was never trained to be disruptive. I was trained to be good and get things right and be likable. That was reinforced to me all the time, particularly. And then if we become more focused about impact on girls and women around body image, you're supposed to be desirable, attractive, nice, smile. This is something that's reinforced to girls and women every single day of their lives. What I've learned with age, now that I'm old and ugly and I don't care about what people think of me anymore, and that just comes with age, is that I now I've realised I can be respectfully disruptive, that I can respectfully but be assertive to say, what about X? And if 7 men in a room who are ministers or CEOs of professional sporting clubs do a bit of, here we go. I knew this. Oh yeah, here we go. Oh yeah, what about the women? Trust me, and people still say those things. I don't care anymore. I wish they wouldn't. I wish they wouldn't respond that way. I wish that I didn't have to ask it, but I ask it anyway, and I'm prepared to have people roll their eyes at me. And I think that I'm fortunate. I've got a great job. I'm in the room. I'm white. I'm middle class. I've got a tertiary education. I'm extremely privileged. If I can't ask those questions, if I can't be respectfully disruptive, who will? Because the single mother with no money who has a disability is not even getting a platform to be in that room, or the trans woman living in a regional town in Victoria is not even getting her hand up, and she's getting, transphobic abuse on Twitter. So if I can't be an advocate for others and ask those questions, then who? If not me, then who? And if not now, then when? Now, that's not an answer though. We don't just need there to be a woman in the room. And what I've seen over time, and particularly we shifted to a new department about 15 months ago. We had a machinery of government. We have an amazing secretary in our department, so he leads the entire department. I have an amazing boss, and the more professionally I can respectfully be disruptive, the more they learn that it's important. And that means I've changed some people's minds and attitudes. And sometimes I need to change my approach and say, oh, but you've got daughters, yeah? You would want them to have the same opportunities or get paid the same. And suddenly for a lot of men, I don't take this personally anymore, suddenly for a lot of men, they think, oh, wow, the context applies to me now. Instead of being something over there, like noisy, late feminist women who are yelling, it's suddenly thinking, oh, my daughter, and we've heard the CEO of Cricket Australia talk about this. He has 5 daughters. And his eldest daughter said to him a few weeks ago, he was telling me, would you be advocating for the WBBL and the women's pay equality deal if you didn't have 5 daughters? And he said, I don't know. It's a good question, but I am. I feel like I talk too much. Sorry.
No, this is what we're here to hear from you. Okay. We've got time for a couple more questions, so let's see if we can do them quickly. What can be done to have more women, girls' stories represented in sports media? We have a locker room, which is fantastic, but flow into regional media is not so good. Thank you, Claire, for that question.
Thank you for your question. It's a great question, and it's a huge one. But what we've started to do is, and on our website, you know, looking at marketing and media guidelines, is how do you write your own press release and send it to the Ballarat advertiser and say, hey, just to let you know that this girl here is on the Olympic long list to be a sport climber. Here's a photo of her. Here's a story about her. So you're doing their job for them. Recognising that regional newspapers are, you know, they're being gutted, and that there's frequently no one doing that gig. And so if they've got a contact who in the men's footy team, they're going to do that story every week until someone provides them with new content. So provide them with the content, send them the high-res photos, write the press release, and then the media, then people start reading about it. And this is the argument I've always delivered around representation of sports media. It's a circular argument of like people trying to get out of having responsibility for the problem. When I raced as a professional cyclist, the women's races were not on TV, even though there were motorbike cameras everywhere filming everything. And we'd say, so they're capturing all this footage, what's happening to it? And the race director would say, well, it's not my responsibility to call Eurosport and give them the content. You think, well, whose is it? Here we are racing our hearts out. The best woman in the world on a bike is right here. Why? If you take that to the audiences, then they'll know who Marianne Vos is. Then they'll say, oh, I want to watch her again. People crave sporting content. So let's give it to them. And we saw this with, of course, the Women's World Cup. The more content we gave people around women's cricket, everyone's going, how good are these women cricketers? You know, we want to see more of this. So, but don't wait for them to come to you. Give them the content, generate the interest, keep posting about it on Facebook and all your free platforms. And if you have a restrictive or a person who's a bit obstructive and not that interested in calisthenics in your regional town, go above them, go around them, you know, find your own way of broadcasting and be a bit disruptive in that way. And get other people to align, you know, sharing information, start liking more posts around girls and women in sport on all platforms so that you're generating more interest.
Completely agree. As a female journalist working in sport, if you have a great story, tell us, connect with us, and we can help share that story. Here is another question from Hussein Hanif. They say, the New Zealand government has recently announced $265 million sport recovery package, providing funding to support women's sport and groups who are currently underrepresented in sport, like people with disabilities, Māori, and those from low socioeconomic groups. How would you spend the money to get maximum outcomes in the community to get more people active? Great question.
I know Hussein Hanif. If it's the Hussein Hanif I know, then I think they want me to spend it on cricket.
That would be fine by me.
So hang on, what have I got? 265 million. Oh, terrific. Well, I don't have enough time to budget this on the back of a napkin right now. But what I do know, I can say about what we're supporting Sport and Rec Victoria to do, what we're advising and providing new advice to our Minister for Community Sport, who in fact is a woman. The first time there's ever been a woman being a Minister for Sport in this state. So we now have one Minister for Professional Sport and one for Community Sport, and she's terrific. What we're advising her, because we have $40 million for community sport economy rescue package, if you like, and a further $68 million that will be and has been announced already for community infrastructure. What we want to see is an understanding of, if you get money as part of that, if you're a sporting organisation or a club that gets money as part of that, show us what programs you're delivering that ensure inclusion of key demographics that have historically not been included by you. And again, it's something I spoke about on Offsiders, but I've spoken to clubs and organisations to say, who has never been engaged here? You've never had disability sport in your particular code. Why is that? Find a person who does it, ask them the questions. What would it take, or what do you need to bring your groups of people into our club? What's been our problem area? This comes back to something I mentioned earlier about a willingness to receive feedback. Now, I'm getting better at it, but I still suck at it mostly. I don't want people telling me that I'm awful or that I handled something badly or I really, really failed in a meeting or handled it the wrong way. But guess what? It actually helps you be better. If someone says, look, I think you came in too hard, you should shush up and wait a bit more. Or I think you needed to, you gave them the wrong information and you forgot to say X and now they're not that on board. You need people in your corner who you trust, who can say those things to you. And the more you do it, and I'm doing this more and more, the more you practice it, the better you get at it. And as an athlete, you get feedback all the time. People say, you're too fat, you're too slow, you're too whatever. It's brutal, but you get used to it. And the reason I talk about feedback is because if you're a club president or an administrator and you can't have someone come to you and say, wow, we've really dropped the ball here. We don't have any girls or women in our club. What's that about? Why is everyone driving past our club to go to a club that's a further hour away? What are they doing right? Are we super sexist? Are we homophobic? Like, what's our problem and how can we remedy it? Mm-hmm. If you're not willing to ask those questions of yourself within your organisation, there's a great saying in medicine, which is if you don't want to find a fever, don't take a temperature. And we see this in dysfunctional intimate relationships too. Like, let's never have marriage counselling because then we'll never find out if anything's wrong and we can just stay unhappy together forever. And yet asking the question, am I happy? Is this good? Am I delivering the right programs? Are we serving the community in the way that we want to? If you don't ask yourself those questions, you'll never be wrong. You just won't have any growth in your membership and you won't have any innovation. So I think people need to be prepared to take feedback.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to finish up very, very soon and I'm going to hand over to Sharon very shortly, but there is one question, and this is the very last question, and it gets asked a lot, and I'm sure that you get this as well. But what's your response to the common anecdote that women's sport don't generate as much revenue, so warrants a lower level of support, resources and investments?
How much time do I have to answer this question? I'd say in our country, I'd say 120 years head start. That's why women's sport hasn't generated the same revenue, sponsors, eyeballs and interest. Because professional men's sport got a 120-year head start. I'm sure if we, and if I use again Aussie rules as an example, in the first season of AFLW, the feedback, criticism and abuse was vitriolic and disgusting. But even the less disgusting vitriolic was all about, she can't kick it as far as him, this is rubbish, therefore, QED, I have proven women's footy's no good. We saw this around the FIFA Women's World Cup last year when American women's national team were asking for equal pay, and the tired and lazy abuse was women's footy is not as good as men's footy. Well, guess what? There's the head start issue. But secondly, if you think about the contribution that all of that investment and time makes, and we think about, let's look at The Last Dance doco, you've had people deeply invested and passionate about men's basketball for decades. Women's basketball is fantastic and exciting, but if you're only measuring how good it is by how high they can jump or the score, then that shows you lack an imagination. It shows you as an audience member or you as a broadcaster don't actually care about the contest. You only care about how high, how fast, how strong. And that's completely lazy. That's lazy, and it also lacks any vision about how to make money in sport, because really the sport is the contest. And I don't know who's seen these hilarious videos over lockdown of that Scottish sports commentator who commentates his dogs fighting over bones or standing in a lake. Commentary is everything. Commentary generates. So when you have Olympics, you have professional, skilled commentators describing the contest. They're not saying in brackets, by the way, the women's marathoner is not as fast as the men's. Those people aren't competing against each other. We're comparing the women's marathoners, where they're from, how they run, their backstory, their style, their ability to deliver in the final kilometre. That's what we care about when we watch the women's marathon, not what the time is.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a great place to finish up. I'm going to throw over now to Sharon Lloyd.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and thank you, Bridie. I'll formally thank you in a moment. In the meantime, for those of you who are with us weekly, you'll see the usual poll come up if you wouldn't mind completing that, and I'll give you the results of that shortly. Wow, what an amazing conversation today. It has been unbelievable to be on the other end and hear these deeply personal, powerful learnings and stories. Thank you so much for sharing so openly and honestly with us. You know, you've had us laughing, questioning ourselves, your advocacy. It's just so inspiring and a beautiful way to spend an hour or so with you. So thank you so much on behalf of the Circle, Sports Connect and Women in Sport Aotearoa. We've had a lot of people come through on the chat and say the respectfully disruptive is their new motto or new
good.
So I think that's going to go viral.
Sure, I just made it up, but you can take it.
I will. It's owned now. And the bounce forward, I really like the bounce forward. You know, we need more positivity coming forward, and bounce forward is brilliant. So thank you so much for your time. And Zoe, thank you to you. Brilliant to have you with us today as well. And great job of moderating today's. Lots of questions coming through. So the results are brilliant. 63% of you are feeling innovative, which is great. 83% of you think the government's doing a good job at the moment. The majority believe that they're planning 12 months until when this will be over. And excellent, 71% of you have a priority on women and girls during your business recovery phase. So thank you again for everyone for dialing in and being with us today, and to Rachel and the team at Women in Sport for partnering with us. We love it so much, and we look forward to seeing everyone again next week. But I will hand over to Bridie for the final farewell.
Oh, thank you. And thanks so much for having me on. Keep your ear to the ground for 25 June, and let's hope that Australia and New Zealand can host the FIFA Women's World Cup in 2023. I'm one of the ambassadors. I don't know anything about football. I've got no skills in that area, but I love the game. I love the work that women all over the world have done to contribute to the game of football. So I'm hoping that we're going to see it in a few years in our own towns. Thank you.